Before I begin, I would like to make a few statements about how I'm going to be doing this series. This is intended to be both a documentary and an examination, meaning that I'm both going to be uncovering Aaron's statements and interacting with the ideas, at times extensively. Since I'll be interacting with these ideas, sometimes in a very extensive format, it's only fair that you're given my general social perspectives ahead of time so you know where I'm coming from. So politically, I'm pro-direct democracy for democratic mass control of social institutions and government affairs. I'm an advocate for a fairer economy, so that includes greatly reduced wage disparity and democratized managerial systems. I'm an advocate for historical evolution, understanding systems and countries as the result of a development of historical circumstances and as pieces that lead to future development of systems. I'm anti-authoritarian, against regimes that are authoritarian, totalitarian, or both. Anti-absolutist, against ideologies and religions that practice and promote us versus them ideas, and the idea that only societies that follow specific religions or ideologies are valid. I'm anti-polarization, which means I'm against the political polarization of the general population of a country, whether that polarization is achieved by the means of religion, ethnicity or race, sex, ideology, or artificial subgroups. And I'm anti-idealist, against the promotion of pre-identified absolutist ends for society and measuring the successes or failures of society by idealized perfectionist standards. If you're only interested in seeing Aaron's posts, I'll have links in the description marked AB for when his different posts come up. As stated before, this will be an extensive critique in many parts, so if you're here for primarily those posts, then go and feel free to look at the timestamps. I'm sure by now that you've all seen the news about a man named Aaron Bushnell, an active service U.S. airman who set himself on fire in front of the U.S.-Israeli embassy to protest the current Israel-Gaza war. He's been lauded as a heroic martyr by some, denounced as a fool by others. But who and what was he truly? For that discussion, we need to go through his history and see what he said. In that way, we'll contextualize his actions. We will look at a number of places where Aaron's beliefs are expressed and examined. His cited last Facebook post, which gives us the most accurate message of what he believed before the time of his death, his extensive history on Reddit, an interview that his friends gave with a website named crimethink.com, and of course, his last words. I should note the limitations of this method before we begin. Reddit provides us with the most concrete view of who Aaron was, with the largest amount of information present. However, as of the time of this recording, Reddit has entirely deleted Aaron's Reddit account. Even while the account was still up as I was doing research for this video, most of his Reddit posts had been removed. The primary exceptions at that time were his video links, his memes, and a few anarchist sites whose moderators seemed to have sympathized with his action and thus left his posts there intact. Before the account was entirely deleted, however, I made numerous screenshots of what he had posted on, and several videos of evidence of me doing that. Additionally, the Internet Archive can be used to reconstruct some of his posts, albeit often with limited context around them. Internet Archive often misses the comment sections and many elements of the Reddit website itself. Additionally, due to the way that Reddit's API has changed, that's how other websites and apps go and access Reddit's publicly available data. Internet Archive is often unable to archive posts above a year old. So in the case of Aaron's account, we have records from 2022, but sketchy records from the later parts of 2023 onwards. There are quotes from Aaron flowing around from his Reddit and Facebook accounts, but I've chosen to only use what I can personally verify to give you the best data available. Once I finish discussing Aaron's political views and history, I'll discuss the response to his actions that we've seen on social media, both from influencers and normal people. This response, by the way, is the primary reason that I'm making this video, because whatever you think of Aaron's action, what his action could promote and provoke is the more important element of all of this. To begin, I'd like to start with his Reddit history, since I think it offers an interesting look at Aaron Bushnell's transformation over the course of a little over 4 years, and does so in his own words. Aaron started using Reddit when he was around 14 or 15 years old, though he only started to actively post on the site about 4 years ago, when he was around 20 years old. As you can see from these first posts, he obviously came from a sheltered conservative Christian background with a lot of social awkwardness being evident. To emphasize this, as you might expect, going into a women's subreddit and asking about strong women is a very odd thing to do. r/askwomen outright logged the post, leading Aaron to go to other places and ask where he could ask the question of women. Finding an answer, he eventually ended up on r/askfeminists, who answered him, but were generally lukewarm on using the term, as one might expect. The most interesting post about his personal stay at this time is the post on r/Christianity entitled, "The State of the Church Today Breaks My Heart." In it, Aaron is depressed about the state of Christianity and the way that Christians argue and treat one another. As we'll find out later, he split with his parents' church somewhat earlier than this, and this split is likely what inspired the post. Aaron says the following in it: "It's been said many times, many ways, but this is on my heart and I feel the need to express it. There are so many things that drive us apart: opposing theologies, judgment, histories of bad faith and bad blood, etc. One thing that I don't think is controversial is that Christ called us to be one body, one church, his body on this earth. The world is in need of God's word, and his body lies in broken pieces. We refuse to take communion with one another. We refuse to worship in the same buildings. We refuse to share our rich traditions and blessings and wisdom with one another, or even to acknowledge our deep and sacred connection to each other through Jesus Christ. We value the secular, theological, and historical differences that separate us over the incredible gifts we have to share with one another, and over our Lord's commandment to love one another as ourselves. As it is, there are many members, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you." 1 Corinthians 12:20-21. And yet we do. May God have the mercy on all of us that we are so reticent to grant each other. As you can see, he still very much believes in Christianity, but he is questioning the attitude of the Christians around him, the church where he came from. His first exposure to what can be considered left-wing ideas comes shortly after, when he discovered the subreddit called r/Radical Christianity. This subreddit hosted people who were generally left-wing Christians, more focused on social morality than religious doctrines. Aaron believed they would be more open to his concerns about the church and his desire for Christian unity. However, he would shortly after find that the people on the subreddit were bashing conservative evangelicals more than he was comfortable with, to which he would post a topic that said, "Look, I like this sub and what it stands for, but why can't we share our beliefs without constantly putting down other Christians?" Replies generally indicate that r/Radical Christianity was more of a meme subreddit at that time, having become that relatively recently. Still, from his post history, it appears that Aaron Bushnell stuck around the subreddit, which marked a transitional point to the ideology that he would later embrace. It was a rejection of his parents' Christianity, of conservative Christianity, but not of Christianity in its entirety yet. His other posts around this time were fairly typical. He had interest in video games, in particular Ark Survival Evolved, pop culture, history, the standard sort of things that one might expect from a somewhat nerdy young man. We see, for example, they posted a list of actors he would want to see if the Aragon fantasy series was put to screen again. He posted a video in r/Christianity called Prayer of St. Gregory, a prayer in darkness, recorded for worshiping and praying at home. Of course, this was the time when many churches were closed in the 2021/2020 era. And this was a video of a prayer his old band at his old church had made, put to music. In this post, Aaron says that he likes the piece, but also mentions that it's from a church he no longer goes to. So we have confirmation that he's split from his parents in many different ways at this point, and that's something that we'll explore later, the influence that environment had upon him growing up. But note that for his general posts on Reddit, he's not going to be bringing that up, so that'll have to wait until we get to talking about what his friends had to say about him. Aaron participated in the r/Bill Blur subreddit, a subreddit hosted by the fans of the comedian Bill Blur. Bill Blur is a left-wing comedian, but he is the sort of left-wing person who is highly critical of political correctness. And this is likely someone that a more conservative person who is leaning towards the left wing would gravitate towards, because he's sort of a middle point between them, you might say. And so that's likely why Aaron initially felt him an appealing person to listen to. Something else is quite evident in these early posts. Aaron had financial difficulties at this age, likely the result of splitting very young from his family and not having a cohesive idea of what he wanted to do with his life. As we'll find out later, he wanted to go to college and become a computer programmer. However, he lacked the finances to go and do that. And so he looked around for things he could do to make money. We see him considering becoming a Uber Eats driver, but that didn't turn out well, and it's likely that he never pursued that at all. A post in r/personal finance stating, "Help, can't get stimulus or unemployment benefits, about to run out of money." This being in the 2020 era, of course, the job market was quite bad, as I'm sure many of us unfortunately experienced, so Aaron didn't have many options for what to do, and there also weren't many options that could offer him the sort of decent paying job where he could go and save up for university. Despite these severe financial troubles, he appears not to have wanted to return to live with his family again, for reasons we'll explore later. And so, he did what many people in the US do when they want to go to college but don't have the money. He decided to join the US military. Specifically, Aaron Bushnell joined the Air Force, which he praised initially, saying, "Man, the Air Force does some cool ass shit." And this he was posting on a video where the Air Force rescued hostages. From this point on, Aaron would be a frequent poster on r/Air Force. We see it here an early example of Aaron's developing hostility towards authoritarianism and specifically a sort of hierarchical rule. And this we can see in his question about China's oppression of the Uyghur people. When asking why China would oppress this ethnic group in this way, he gets some normal responses about how China is very oppressive towards religion, and of course a few outright denials from the resident tankies. At this time, I believe Aaron would have generally considered himself to be a center libertarian. One of his favorite posting habits at this time, and one that would continue throughout his life, was his love of pop cultural memes. His particular favorites were Avatar, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, and later memes related to the Elden Ring game. He seems to have mostly cross-posted the memes from other people, with only a few potentially created by him personally. typical of the memes they like to post is the following meme he cross-posted in r/unexpected avatar. And another meme that he posted in r/Korasami. Yep, Korasami, lads. Turns out that Aaron was extremely obsessed with the romantic lesbianship between the characters Korra and Asami from the children's TV show The Legend of Korra. Of course, for those who don't know, Korasami is one of the most fanatical ships on the internet. It was extremely enthusiastic, and it kind of made its ship canonical in the series, so that just tells you how influential and how much they pushed for it. But yeah, so right near the start of Aaron's Reddit experience, we see that he was participating in the r/Korasami Reddit. And it's here that I'll briefly note that this is one of the strong indicators of Aaron being a highly functioning autistic, as sexualizing characters from childhood media is a very common autistic trait. Perhaps surprisingly, even as Aaron went far into a more politicized mindset, into discussing politics constantly, into being very hostile against general society, he would continue to participate in and post in the r/Korasami Reddit throughout the rest of his life, with the last post on it coming only a month before his death. A post that seems to strongly indicate they continued to fetishize the Korasami relationship until that point. We'll get to that when we come to it. For now, we'll just note that the meme that Aaron posts makes fun of the character Mako for losing his girlfriends to one another. This is both an early example of Aaron breaking with conventional sexual relationships, which will take much further down the line, and also him breaking with his parents' Christianity by obsessing over a lesbian relationship. He posted several more times in the Korasami subreddit, and also continued to post in r/Radical Christianity. With r/Radical Christianity now frequently being about memes, an art form that Aaron absolutely loved and which formed a great deal of his participation on Reddit and Facebook, it likely appealed to Aaron's sense of self-expression. Now leaning towards left-wing Christianity, he made a post on r/Christianity titled, "In honor of Black History Month, may I suggest The Radical King, a collection of speeches, sermons, and essays by Martin Luther King Jr., performed by Black actors on Audible." In that post he says, "The way that this man wrestled with worldly issues from a thoroughly religious and spiritual perspective is awe-inspiring and deeply refreshing." Martin Luther King Jr., of course, was a rather famous Christian socialist, and this is what the book that Aaron recommends is talking about. So, contextualizing Martin Luther King Jr. in the broader African-American pro-Christian, pro-socialist movement. And it's here that one of Aaron's more typical perspectives would come out. Aaron strongly gravitates towards the ideology of African-American leftism rather than the more contemporary forms of leftism, such as Breadtube, that would be more in line with the Euro-American perspective. Actually, we'll later see that he has very strong reservations about the Euro-American-led Breadtube. And it's here that I just want to point out that at this point in Aaron's ideological journey, we've seen nothing to be directly concerned about. He's someone who grew up in a highly conservative circle and then decided to go and reject that ideology and become more left-wing. This is a journey that many people make, many normal people make. It is not something to be concerned about. However, we start to see that he is falling in with groups that can be considered as gateways to more extreme ideologies. So, for example, in the right wing, I can tell you that libertarianism is very oftentimes the gateway drug to much more extreme ideologies on the right. And this is because, on the surface level, it appears inoffensive. But once people start looking more into it and starting to go and take more logical conclusions this way and that, they oftentimes find themselves in more extreme circles. And it's the same way in the left. So in the left, you have people who go and lean towards socialism or one of the more contemporary, perhaps more, we can even say, typical movements on the center left. And then they go a little bit farther into the left itself. And this is where they then start to get exposed to things like anarchism, Marxism, democratic socialism, these sorts of movements. And this is often comes via sources that seem on the surface to be relatively non-offensive, such as the aforementioned Breadtube, for example. And then, of course, when you look into Breadtube a lot more, it's a lot of democratic socialists there. I don't mean, incidentally, Democrat as in the Democratic Party of the US. I mean people who are much more on the left than the Democratic Party of the US would generally hold to. And in the US, those persons oftentimes refer to themselves as democratic socialists. So that is where our terminology here is coming from. Is this break that oftentimes we see in the conservative youth, because the conservative youth who go over to the left-wing circles, they oftentimes apply the same sort of missional or highly fanatical philosophy to their newly embraced left-wing beliefs, which is why we oftentimes see the left as being highly missional. And of course, this isn't something that was new to the modern era. If we go back and look at Marx very much considered communism as a sort of secular Christianity, as did Engels. And many of the people who embraced that ideology applied a very religious framework to it. And we'll discuss that later. But that's just to say that we should be aware of which groups can be gateway groups to more extreme ideologies. And if you know someone who is involved in one of those groups, is perhaps at least a charitable thing to go and tell them that that is potentially what they could be getting themselves into, and then start to, look behind the surface a little bit. So if you're going to be a libertarian, perhaps go and look into the history of someone like Lew Rockwell, whose site you'll probably be reading, and then perhaps you'll go and look at the stuff they said about being pro-Confederate and all this sort of junk, and then you'll perhaps say, well, perhaps this guy is just going and using this as a gateway to get people into more extreme movements. In r/no stupid questions, Aaron asks whether using a phrase from the song Jesus Loves Me on a bumper sticker would be considered offensive. So for those who aren't aware of this song, it was a very common song in Protestant Christian circles. And at the time it was written with the intention to say that, oh, Jesus loves, children of every ethnicity, every race, all that sort of thing. But of course, nowadays we have the issue that it uses and employs outdated language such as red for Native Americans, yellow for Asians, etc., etc. Of course, these denominators were never correct at all. The Native American association with red was actually because the first explorers in the Americas, the first Native Americans that they ran into, had the habit of painting their entire bodies with a red ochre. And so that's why they were called Redskins. And this is despite the fact that basically no other Native American group in North America has that tendency. So red's not a very accurate description of them at all. And of course, they're mostly a population that are various degrees of tan. And yellow for the Asians was a descriptor that actually came out of China, where the Chinese said they were descended from a man named the Yellow Emperor, and so their sacred color was yellow. But of course, the Asians and the Chinese, they're not all yellow in their skin tone or anything. They're, again, usually light to tan. So, most people who responded to this post were puzzled by the question, asking why people were being associated with colors like this in the first place. And so this, again, just highlights why I consider it to be Aaron's high amount of social awkwardness at this time. A little later on, he posted a rant on r/Air Force called "Stop Complaining About Being Underpaid." In this post, he makes it clear that he believes that everyone who joined with the Army knew what they were getting into. He also says that he doesn't plan on re-enlisting after the term of his contract is finished, and that he primarily joined for the college credits. So that just goes to show you that Aaron thought that the Air Force did a lot of cool things, but he was not primarily joining for the ideology of the US military. We then see that Aaron posted an extensive flowchart joking about how hard it was to get a religious exemption to vaccination in the military. So this is perhaps something that he looked into. Of course, Aaron was also someone who was potentially looking into conspiracy theories at this time. So we saw him asking a alternative history question to Reddit at one point. Generally speaking, his conspiracy theories would not be at this time. He would later embrace some of the ones that are more on the left-wing side of things, like, for example, the FBI killed Martin Luther King Jr. and that sort of thing. And after all of this, he would begin to ask various subreddits about their recommendations for pursuing a computer science degree. In particular, he was looking at an online college, since obviously that's a cheaper way of going about it than a in-person college. It is here that I also have to take a slight detour. Aaron is relying extensively upon social media to form his thoughts, to get people's opinions on things. And this is evident from all of the influence that he draws from YouTubers and asking Reddit questions. And the problem here is that this is going to have a very bad effect later on, to have bad consequences later on. The reality is that extensively relying on social media is a terrible idea for several reasons. First thing is that the sort of person who is a power user on social media is very rarely someone who has a normal outlook on life. So, for example, on Twitter, it's been estimated that the top number of people, the top 10% of people who tweet go and generate more tweets than everyone else on the site. So, which means that for every tweet one person, a normal person, is doing, these people are tweeting at least 10 times. And this is similar on basically anywhere that you'll go. So if you go on to YouTube, people who have a lot more time than any normal person, well, they're going to have a lot more time to invest in certain very specific videos, and they're going to thus have a lot more video viewing time than normal people. And so it is with people on Reddit, Twitter, whichever social media site you go on to, the same sort of phenomena is going to repeat. And what that can do is that can give the perception of an outsized support to certain positions. So these sort of people who have tons and tons and tons of time to spend online are also very oftentimes the sort of persons who are a lot more politicized than anyone who is normal. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that they oftentimes aren't interacting with normal people, so they don't know what the normal populace is like, what they think. Instead, they basically isolated themselves in an algorithmic bubble. And what I mean by an algorithmic bubble is that if you can imagine that you go onto YouTube just with a fresh account. Now imagine that you go and watch 10 videos from an alt-right source or 10 videos from a Breadtube source in a row. Well, what you're going to find out is that the algorithm is going to keep recommending you whichever of those sources that you went to. And this is true with almost any topic that you go for. So for a lot of people, this won't be politicized stuff, but it could be something, for example, you watch 10 cute videos about pets in the row. And what you're going to find is that YouTube keeps recommending you videos about pets. Or if you go and follow a bunch of pet-related accounts on Twitter, then you're going to keep getting recommended pet-related accounts, and you're going to go and get your hashtags recommended from pet-related stuff, etc., etc. But what that does is that means that you can effectively isolate yourself in an algorithmic bubble, meaning that you aren't seeing what people who have other perspectives are seeing. You're simply seeing what people who have very similar viewing habits to yourself are seeing. Compounding to this issue is the reality that social media is very surface level in nature. And one of the very good examples of that is the concept of the meme itself. So the meme is a short form for a memetic idea, or an idea that goes through society and which becomes integrated into society. It was originally a fairly eloquent idea which was popularized by Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist. But on the internet, the idea basically came to be associated with these quick internet memes and then people who did something that went viral. So an excellent example of this is if you've ever seen Pepe the Frog, for example. Pepe the Frog was originally a character from a webcomic that was a stoner, and he was basically this, his creator's idea of a drug-using hippie, essentially. But what happened is that a bunch of people went and took the image of Pepe, and then they put him to a meme which was feels good man, feels bad man. More typically, the feels bad man. And so then when a bunch of ideas were coming around or political situations were coming around, you constantly see Pepe associated with them in feels bad man. And so, of course, what happens is that this goes and picks up a bunch more political momentum, and then suddenly, people are using Pepe in all of these absolutely crazy ways. Like, Pepe is no longer a hippie stoner. Well, now Pepe is perhaps going and parading around in like a pseudo-Nazi-like uniform. It got ridiculous to the point that the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016 was talking about how Pepe was being weaponized against them. Of course, at this time it was a really ridiculous reaction. What actually happened at that time was that Pepe had become kind of an integral part of gamer culture, so you're seeing like little gamified versions of Pepe. So, for example, I've seen characters from various video games, except they're Pepe wearing that sort of outfit. And then what happened is that people also made the association between this basically World of Warcraft, which is a very massive game. The way that people were short form laughing in that game was typing the words K-E-K, Kek. And people did a little bit of looking around, and it turns out that Kek was the Egyptian god of chaos. A was associated with a frog. So now people are saying, oh, Kek, Pepe, these two things are associated, and then Pepe becomes the symbol of internet chaos. Wojak is one that I also very much love myself. It's the idea of Wojak as the common man who's facing life's absurdities. He's probably somewhere in the millennial or late Zoomer age bracket. He's, bald. He's lost all of his hair because he's kind of stressed from his life that he's living. Just the standard, ordinary go to work, grind for 8 hours a day, come back home, get stuck in traffic for 2 or 3 hours, that sort of thing. So a very classic character, and his name in Polish is actually Wojak. which means warrior in Polish. So the idea that you're a warrior against what's going on around you, that you're a warrior who is battling even just for yourself, for your own sanity. So that's the idea behind what Wojak is. Unfortunately, that's another character who gets abused a ton in various meme-related stuff. He gets portrayed sometimes as being a ideological fanatic, even, which is just a very, very misinterpretation of the character. So the issue, though, that we arrive at with memes is kind of twofold. So I've told you about Pepe and Wojak. Those are two highly classic memes. They're memes that have been around for years and years, and people love them, and people continue to use them because there is a value, because people have associations with them, which I know it sounds weird. Like, you look at Pepe and you go, well, that's just kind of a poorly drawn frog, but what people have done with that poorly drawn frog is just, they've done almost everything that you can think of with him. Same thing with Wojak again. But most memes are not really like that. Most memes are, well, first off, they're not memes in the sort of memetic idea context. What a meme is that you go and essentially put an image, and then you go and type out a little funny message to it, and then you go and put that out into the world, and then sometimes it sticks. If it sticks, it's only usually going to be around for a short while, and there's, you know, a very slight fraction of attempted memes that go and tend to go and stick around for any length of time. And by any length of time, I usually mean that a meme could have, you know, a month or perhaps 2 months. That's the sort of area where you're looking at. And then you have some memes that become popular, but for anyone who thought that the original concept was funny, they're almost immediately dead on arrival. So the biggest one for me that's like that is the Karen meme. So the funny thing about the Karen meme, of course, is that the idea of a woman who goes and is acting entitled and obsessive in public, and the reason that she's given the name Karen is because Karen is Roman for beautiful. So she's not acting, of course, very beautiful at all. It's a very ironic use of the term. And when I was working in a pet shop in my teens, I actually had an encounter with this one woman who was absolutely the definition of what you would consider a Karen to be. So I'm at the front desk. She comes barging into the store and then starts immediately demanding a refund for this one item that she has. And unfortunately, my manager's not in at the time, so I can't go and give her a refund. And then she just starts arguing with me and screaming at me. And then she starts saying, oh, you know, I've tried to do this like a half dozen times and nobody's gone and refunded me. Well, this is utter nonsense. At that time, I was one of the few general employees who, you know, was sometimes left to manage the store themselves. I know it was very, looking back, it was kind of an odd thing to do at that sort of age, but just the idea that she'd managed, you know, was claiming to have done that 6 times. Well, absolutely not. Any one of the other employees would have had the ability to go and give her a refund, but yeah, not me. So absolutely, I'd never seen her before in my life. So just, you know, that sort of absolutely hideous and appalling, uncompassionate attitude, you know, treating retail workers like they're dirt. It's absolutely hideous. And, you know, these are people who I think can't put themselves in the minds of other people to go and see what other people would be like. And, you know, we've seen these people all the time. I mean, another example of this was, at this one time I stopped at the bar of a gas station to go and grab an item. And so I go inside and there's this old 50-year-old jackass who's literally screaming at the girl behind the counter, who I'm going to say is like 16, and he's blaming her for not having his Christmas tree, and it just, oh. Looking back at that retrospectively, anyways, I kind of hope that my presence there cut that short, but just, ugh. Sometimes, there are things that you wished you'd intervened with, but that's all just to say, though, that the meme idea behind Karen is something that we as retail workers, those of us who have worked as retail workers in the past, we encountered it. But the issue is that then what happens is that people then go and apply that to things that they shouldn't, that just apply to, any woman who goes and is in public and is sort of agitated. So, and sometimes there's even women who, have a good cause to be agitated. So, which is why the Karen meme essentially got run into the ground about a week after it launched into the public consciousness. But of course, people will just keep on repeating it. We have memes like boomers, which are, again, it's a kind of funny concept. So the idea that old people are, bad at technology, essentially. But boomer once more got run into the ground because people then had the idea of, oh, let's go and apply boomer suddenly to, people who are like 50, 40. There's even a joke about the 30-year-old boomer, which, what was that channel that Prince of Zimbabwe, I think was his name? He made a lot of memes about the 30-year-old boomer, or essentially what would happen if 30-year-old men were, reimagined as boomers, and just, so that's the idea of a memetic idea, though. You get what I mean. The worst part of a memetic idea is that a lot of them aren't playful like that. A lot of them are actively harmful to society. So you think of an idea like, well, a lot of the language that we're going to be looking at later, that is essentially the hyper emotional language that goes and gets people to go and fanatically swear their loyalty to something like a anarchism or democratic socialism. This language is a memetic idea. It's not language which is it's language which is designed to go and bypass actual thought, replacing your thought with repeated slogans, words that you have an emotional attraction to, an emotional response to. Same thing with almost any slogan. So business slogans, they want you to have an emotional reaction to their own memetic ideas, which are McDonald's, blah blah blah, I'm loving it. That's a memetic idea that has spread somewhat throughout society. Subway, eat fresh, memetic idea, puts in your mind that Subway has fresh ingredients, fresh sandwiches. Almost every other sort of brand has these sort of concepts behind them. So it's a very refined psychological way of manipulating the crowd specifically, because the crowd is where repeated slogans overwhelm logical thought, and it's very easy to go with ideas of the crowd because it is easy. You do not have to think about the ideas in a crowd, you just go with the energy of the crowd. And algorithmic bubbles go and reproduce this psychology, so you can go and get swept up into using the words of people around you simply for the fact that those are the people that you're associating with all the time. Those are the people whose language that you adopt. And so fundamentally, I just want to emphasize that we must be aware that memetic ideas can become used to constrain you. And the idea of outsourcing your thought to memetic ideas, to very specific politicized language that is designed to promote an emotional reaction in you, this is the biggest issue with a memetic idea. We can consider it to be a parasitic memetic idea. And so, for example, what you're going to see in later on, this is going to be especially once I get around to the um, next part of this series where I talk about the response to Aaron on social media, is that you're going to go and constantly see that people who self-identify themselves as secularists, atheists, communists, Marxists, Democrat socialists, in other words, not religious people, oftentimes people who have outright contempt for religion, you're going to see that they use religious language constantly to go and talk about actions like these, because this religious language that has been put into our society doesn't die just because someone goes and ceases to believe in that religion. It continues on inside your psychology. You just work it a different way. And to go and expel a parasitic memetic idea, you have to be very conscious in how you do it, which means that you have to go and recognize what a parasitic memetic idea looks like. And you have to go and differentiate yourself from the psychology of the crowd. You have to go and truly individualize yourself. I hope you found that aside very useful. I would like you to keep that idea in mind as we go on, as I think it will start to explain much of what you're going to see in this discussion. And now let's continue. Around this time, which is again fairly early on in Aaron's social media career, it's a little over 2 years ago at this point, he played a video game named Sekiro, which is a game where you're basically a Japanese ninja. And he would become a big Souls-like fan after this, particularly a fan of the game Elden, which will be released later on. And you can see that he also commented twice on a post about what was lacking in military healthcare. So he's definitely interested in the general culture of what's going on in the military at this point. I suspect that he's also having a lot of doubts at this point because of course, the more left-wing groups that he's associating himself with. None of them happen to like the military. And so this is going to be a big conflict going forwards. Interestingly enough, he posted a pro-Ukrainian meme in r/Ukrainian conflict at the start of the 2022 invasion, indicating that he was still relatively pro-Western at this time, or at least willing to support a country that was being invaded by another country. This is also where he became extremely hyped for the release of Elden Ring, which would be a frequent discussion topic for the rest of his life, even up to, I believe, 2 weeks before his death. So essentially, this is a game which he would be constantly playing in his off time, presumably, and constantly loving. And it was regarded, for those who don't know, as the big game release of 2022. So lots and lots of people loved Elden Ring. It's a very mainstream game. And one topic of interest, a video that he posted a link to, was entitled How Souls Games Save You by the YouTuber Daryl Talks Games. And this video is about the psychology of why Souls games can potentially help to remedy mental health crisis by providing an avenue for overcoming, for achieving something that seems very difficult. And it's a sort of video that's discussing the paradox of that. And this is someone, Daryl Talks Games, who hadn't played a Souls-like game before he made this video, but then he was very appreciative of them when he went and did his research for that video. So he came to view them as a very interesting form of art, and they are very interesting forms of art from the general perspective of video games. Some of the more deep game systems, deep ideas even. But for Aaron to post this video, I believe this is related to some of the difficulties and doubts that he was having at this time. So doubts about what he'd done. The issue is, of course, that once you're contracted in the military, you can't go and get out of the military. It doesn't work like that. So he was stuck in the military as someone who is oftentimes probably doubting whether he should have done that, who is probably leaning towards, oh, I shouldn't have done that. I will note that he doesn't hate the military yet, but he has deep concerns about it. He very much is starting to doubt the idea of a hierarchical organization of society, and obviously the military is one of those places that has a extremely hierarchical organization. Of course, for um, many of us, if you're a person like me, you think that it's too hierarchical, especially for a organization that's functioning in a democracy. It should at certain points be more um, democratic. Of course, we cannot go and fully democratize the military for the simple reason that a military requires a hierarchy to go and make quick snap decisions that we unfortunately can't replicate in a democracy, or would perhaps even be desirable on a battlefield. So a military needs a hierarchy, but it doesn't have to be one that is as strict a hierarchy as is right now. So that would be my personal critique of the military, as I'm sure many others would perhaps agree with that sort of sentiment. However, immediately after this post on how Dark Souls games can save you, he began posting on r/Breadtube. Breadtube, for those unaware, is a loose collective of left-wing political and cultural commentator YouTubes who are typically more than the center-left. They're oftentimes people who consider themselves strict left or democratic socialists, or even in a few cases, essentially like Marxist light. And they typically focus on long video essays, pop culture essays. Oftentimes they go and reach for and try and refute various low-hanging fruit of other topics. Like, for example, one of their favorites would be something like the flat earth idea, which is, of course, very low-hanging fruit, very easy idea to go and refute. I'll mention that's different from, for example, strict atheists. For example, I think a lot of people in Breadtube, perhaps the majority, would identify as atheists, but it's different from like an atheist tube. It is going to have some crossover with the Atheism Plus movement, which is, of course, the movement that basically went, we need atheism and we also need cultural ideology, and we're going to go and combine those two together, which is basically entirely missing the point of atheism, but oh well. Oh well. In my estimation, Breadtube is not a very good organization, not a very good collective. It has a lot of very surface level ideas, and they're ideas, though, that you're going to go and get told that you're geniuses for believing in, geniuses for watching these people because they make long, drawn out videos that are unnecessarily long in a lot of cases. And of course, they're much more reaching for very easy to refute topics much of the time. And because they're engaging with these very easily to refute people, it can go and give their viewers a sort of superiority complex. And this is essentially what you're looking at with Breadtube. Examples of Breadtubers include PhilosophyTube, ContraPoints, HH Bomber Guy, Hassan Piker, Vosh, and a number of others. However, it should be noted that the label has become increasingly controversial over the years, and a number of people formerly associated with Breadtube have denounced the label. So, for example, Lindsay Ellis, the video reviewer, has gone and said she doesn't want to be associated with Breadtube, and this has happened to a very large number of people who many people had considered to be Breadtubers. So all this is just to say that you should not go and label everyone who is a left-wing YouTuber as a part of Breadtube. Anyone who is a left-wing YouTuber who goes and discusses politics as a part of Breadtube. And a good example of this rejection of the Breadtuber label, ironically, are the YouTubers that Aaron initially posted on r/Breadtube. While FD Signifier and T1J are both generally regarded as left-wing thinkers, They have issues with Breadtube because they regard themselves as members of the African American left, and they see Breadtube as dealing more with the sort of issues that the Euro Americans or the more upper middle class Americans might face. So, and this is especially true. For example, if you go and look over these various people, Hassan Piker very much stands out as being someone who is a very wealthy person who came from a very wealthy background. And a number of these other various breadtubers here, they at least came from a fairly decent background, background where their families were solidly middle class. So, in other words, they're not poor people at all. And in the case of Andrewism, who Aaron would also sometimes cite, Andrewism rejects the label of the left altogether, seeing it as a too disparate word for movements that are too different from one another to be regarded as being the same or similar. And in this post on r/breadtube, the videos that Aaron posted directly involve FT Signifier and T1J criticizing the online left, specifically Breadtube. The second post that Aaron made on r/Breadtube right after this is also reflective of his changing emphasis. During this time, he would strongly come to associate anarchism with the abolition of social norms and social hierarchies of all kinds. And he does not limit that just to what you might think of. So he doesn't limit that just to government. He goes and applies that to the relationships that men and women have together, that partners have together. And this involves the rejection of gender norms, the idea that there is a normal genderality. And this is where he posts a request asking for videos on non-binary gender identity from r/Breadtube. The subject of non-binary gender and transgenderism would become increasingly common topics for his posts during the rest of his life. Now, part of this, of course, is just that there was this massive explosion in particularly transgenderism and non-binaryism that came in with the aftermath of the Trump presidency, and then a lot of people being stuck home with the in the 2020/2021 area, and of course starting to go and fall into a lot of these online areas that Glenn advocated for that sort of thing. And also, of course, with the fallout of the hipsterism as an identity. So the idea behind hipsterism, for those who don't know, is that you went and essentially made a gimmick your personality. So, for example, one example of a hipster that I encountered was in a health food store. There's this guy who was standing in line behind me, and his personality shtick, his hipsterism, was that he had a very big long beard, and he was carrying around a boombox which he was playing on just like this tiny, a very low volume, obviously not to go and be too offensive to people around. And he was just bobbing his head aggressively with it, doing that sort of thing. So a very comical thing to go and do. And just a good example of hipsterism. That's why people ultimately went and saw hipsterism as a very vapid idea, because it had this idea that your gimmick, the clothes you wore, how you groomed yourself, etc., etc. Well, this was now going to be your personality stick, what defined you. And of course, that's just going and shifting to the unfortunate issue that you don't really have a personality and that you're just trying to essentially fake one. And so, of course, where that ties into the transgenderism is that then you have the idea that, okay, so one of the things that defines me is my mental illness. That comes in from the Tumblr days, where you, of course, have all of these girls who are going and claiming various forms of mental illness, and they're self-diagnosing with all of these massive number of conditions. Everyone's got a mild case of autism, etc., etc., etc. And then one of the ways that people went and communicated that is that you had people who are going and changing up their hairstyles and that, so giving themselves these wacky, really weird colors that were essentially going and communicating that sort of mental trauma inside. And then, so what you then had happen is that the ideas, essentially all of these ideas went and converged together, and then also potentially also took some hints from the old emo movement, where it's like, I don't like my body at the moment, I don't like who I am, I'm going to go and constantly glorify death, and going and doing cutting myself, and etc etc etc. So all these movements, which were countercultural and were extremely popularized around this time of the millennials, and then the millennials kind of transferred them over to the Zoomers. And so all of these things went and conjoined together, and then essentially became what we know as the modern day obsession with gender and transgenderism. So you also had, of course, the rising of homosexuality during this time. And so amongst the millennials, to go and give, there's this idea that, straight people are entirely vanilla, normies, blah, blah, blah. So I'm just going to go call myself a bisexual, and my bisexuality career might be as limited as, going and kissing a girl one time is such a, just essentially just a fake thing, very, very fake sort of style, not actually interested in having sex with people of the same gender. I'm just going to go and say, I'm emotionally, romantically attached to people of the same gender, and so I'm essentially bisexual. So what happened at the convergence of this time is that you had all of these four different movements came together, and so then the idea became, I'm going to have, instead of a personality, I'm going to go and give myself a gender identity, and then that's going to go be my personality, and I'm going to go and advocate for all the things that people of that gender identity are going and advocating for, and that's going to be me from now on. Transition comes from the emo, who has, of course, a very strict clothing style that goes in, communicates their inner emotions, and then you have the hipster, which is the clothing style as a gimmick, and then finally you have the transgender, which is, of course, and other gender types, which are the gender clothing style as the indication of the inner type, the inner personality. And so that's essentially what we're seeing here with all this gender identity, transgenderism, that sort of thing. So very much a fad, very much a thing that I think will start to calm down in a few years, but obviously it's the sort of thing that got a massive push in the media and so on, but we don't need to go and focus on that too much later. So all that just to go and say that Aaron is going to be very interested in promoting the idea of non-binary gender and transgenderism. This perhaps might indicate that he does have some questions about himself in that term as well. Not just that he is going and being an ally for these people, as many in the anarchist group and that sort of areas are. Moving on the Elden Ring subreddit, he posted a lore video from the YouTuber Ratosker, showing how deeply interested he was in the subject of Dark Souls lore. Now, of particular interest to us at this time, and I think this needs to be noted because it is a common theme. We've seen how important pop culture is to Aaron. He interacts with it all the time, and even after he becomes an anarchist, he's going to still come back to all of this pop culture and essentially corporate media stuff. He's not someone who we can see going out and looking into independent media, independent music, independent films, independent games. These are things that one would expect if you were, going into a very hard anarchist perspective, or even a very hard left-wing perspective, that perhaps those are more the sorts of people that you would be going and at least supporting. But instead he goes and continues on with the stuff that he knows and it loves, so the corporate media. And the important part about that with his interest in the Dark Souls lore in particular is that Dark Souls has this idea of the linking of the flame. Now, you might be asking, okay, what is that? Well, the idea in the Dark Souls universe is that the ages are separated by this event known as the linking of the flame. And during each age, it basically goes and declines from a place where there is fire and hence light, and goes and declines and gradually turns into darkness. As the age declines into darkness, a hero arises whose destiny is to relink the flame and thus begin a new age, an age that will give the people who are existing in the world at that time a new hope. It will go and banish away the monsters from the world. Essentially, it's the idea of a sacrificial king in the end. So, as you're playing through the Dark Souls games, you eventually come to the end of them, and at the end, what you do is you have the choice. So, the choice is you either link the flame, in which case you will go and sacrifice yourself to the fire. You will go and reach into the fire, and then you will let your body be consumed by it, burning to death. Or you will allow the Age of Dark to continue. And if that is the case, then the Age of Dark will go and take over, and there will be no more fire, no more life. As someone who is interested in the lore, Aaron would be aware that this is a critical element of it. And so the idea is that as you're in the era of shadows, where it's becoming increasingly dark, the people around start to go and turn into the undead. So you're going and walking through abandoned kingdoms where basically everyone is dead, nobody's alive, very few people have continued to exist in the world. And then you're still going to go and light the flame, and then you're going to go and banish the curse of undeath from everyone, and then you're going to be the hero, but you're not going to live to see your heroism. You're going to be dead. You're going to have been burned. You're going to be a Lord of Cinders, is what they're called. The problem, of course, is that you can see here that Aaron could have been inspired by this concept to go and burn himself alive, because if you think about what he did, he was intending to become a sort of sacrificial king. The idea being that he would alleviate the suffering of the Palestinians by going and burning himself alive on camera, and then starting a sort of revolution that would lead people to go and advocate for the Palestinians and then stop the war against the Palestinians. And so how he viewed the culture of America at the time was also very similar to the idea of an undead world. So he was very skeptical of America. He was very critical about most aspects of America, as we're going to go and see later on. And so I bring this up to say that this is a potential place where Aaron got the idea to go and burn himself. So a lot of people have gone and referenced Duc of Vietnam as one of his potential, the potential people who he could have gotten this from. I have not seen any indications that Aaron was interested in Buddhism or was interacting with Buddhism. And I see a lot of indications that he was interacting deeply with the Dark Souls style of games. And someone who has, posted videos about the lore of Dark Souls a number of times, the lore of Elden Ring a number of times, I would suggest that this is perhaps a more likely case of where he got the idea for what he did. You take that for what it's worth. There won't be any sort of indication left from Aaron where he got the idea to go and burn himself alive like this. But I think that this is at least a good potentiality, and to me it fits with his very pop culture focused viewpoint. He again posts on r/Breadtube, and this time is a video by the YouTuber Andrewism. In this case, though, the video is entitled "Humanity is Not a Parasite," which is a very good point to make. Unfortunately, in these sorts of very left communities, you can oftentimes find people who go in for the hyper-environmentalist route of just going and saying, oh, humanity is a parasite upon the earth, a bad creature that is always destructive of the environment. But no, this is of course is not the case. Humans can do very good things for the environment, and this video presumably is offering a correction to the misanthropic viewpoints sometimes expressed by certain environmentalists. And of course, that is just as a note, certain environmentalists. This is not to go and slag off the vast majority of the environmentalist movement, but you know the types that we're talking about. The most extreme branch of them, of course, are the human extinction nut jobs, but the less said about those nut jobs, the better. Again, we have to make the point that Aaron is strongly resonating with the African American left rather than the Euro American left of Breadtube. And the vast majority of people that he praises and recommends are of the African American left rather than of the Breadtube left. This isn't to say that he will never go and have influences from Breadtube. Of course, he is a very frequent poster in Breadtube, and I think that he definitely drew influence from them, but I would say that the primary ideological influence was from the African American left. And so this is also likely where a lot of his distrust of general society came in, which is more going to be emphasized in the African American left for historical reasons than would be by Breadtube, which is, I think, a lot more of a mixed bag on how they feel about society, essentially, given that a lot of them are also, of course, better off than a lot of us in general. And so all that's to say that Aaron is going to very strictly reject American society later on, and this is likely the influences that he's drawing from to go and do that. And now we get to the next major post, and one that I think is very important, and that is his first post in r/DankLeft. r/DankLeft describes itself as follows. This is a subreddit for Marxists, anarchists, and DemSocs, Democratic Socialists, with only the most dank and most left memes. Proletarians of all nations unite. Seize the memes of production. You have nothing to lose but your frown. And rather bizarrely, the first rule of the subreddit states, no reactionaries. This is one of those funny, bizarre traits amongst these groups that are definitely, by a normal person's estimation, reactionary, given what they're like. But they have a tendency to go and describe anyone who reacts against their against what they see on these sites, against what they see these sorts of people doing, and they go and label them as reactionaries. So very, very comical. So apparently if you go and have opinions or try to do stuff against these types, they go and label you as a reactionary. So, yep. And the background of the subreddit, as you can see, has black roses and anarchist symbols on a red background, a black power hand symbol, the Antifa flags, yellow hammers and sickles, and bars representing the transgender and gay flags. So we talked about the concept of normativity and what is normal. And here I'm just going to say that the entire point of this seems to be that you're for the abnormal, right? These are very niche groups, all of them. And so the idea that this is a whole power to the people movement, I mean, how much of the population do you think has these sorts of viewpoints? I mean, well, for starters, like, how many homosexual people would enjoy a Reddit like this for the start? So do you really apply the gay flag correctly? How many of the transgender people would agree with this? And then we know that there are a lot of communists out there that absolutely hate transgender and gay people. You see them all the time. So like this guy I'll show you later on called Haas, he absolutely hates gay people. You have black power hand symbol, again, black power people, oftentimes known for being anti-gay as well. And Antifa, well, that's as we'll again see later. Um, we're going to go through all those Antifa fellows who are flag waving for Assad and Putin. Well, we're going to see that perhaps their alleged anti-authoritarian commitment is not as prominent as they'd like people to think. Aaron's first post on the subreddit is a meme that's as follows: Google will start auto-deleting abortion clinic visits from user location history. Google, I am a generous God. As a side note, I'll note that even as he continues to go farther into left-wing anarchism, he still has this bizarre tendency to use corporate media as memes. In this case, the meme comes from the crappy 300 movie that has a bizarre and offensively ahistorical depiction of Persians, actually being the complete opposite of what any Zoroastrian ruler would present themselves as. r/DankLeft will become a frequent place he visited over the next years, perhaps being a major influence on him, given how memes had a large influence on his ideology and were the primary way he expressed himself. This influence took place somewhat over 2 years before he died. I also note that this is the first truly radical subreddit that he engaged with. Breadtube makes a lot of noise, but ultimately never strays particularly far from establishment left ideas. Sites like r/DankLeft are intended to push people much farther than conventional society is comfortable with and can thus be considered as extremists. Soon after, he would post a video on Bill Blur's subreddit called Gender Theory for Dudes. As established earlier, the people on Bill Blur's subreddit were generally left-leaning, but not enthusiastic about such ideas. They posted the following responses to his post. Jesus fuck, the sub has gone to the toilet. Yawn. This marks the turning point where Aaron would become publicly enthusiastic about promoting the idea of a gender spectrum. By June of 2022, we can see Aaron Bushnell making comments again about electoralism, the idea that you can change politics with democratic voting, and talking about the overthrow of the political ruling class, indicating that he's fully entrenched in anarchism by this time. Additionally, he also states that the police shouldn't exist, that the state is a self-interested institution which is founded on violence and imposing will through violent force, and that the institution of the police is unreformable. He also expressed the opinion that the two political parties in the US, the Democrats and the Republicans, were basically in league with one another and kept power by separating the working class and keeping them fighting. He talked about anti-SJW militias and expressed that there was no such thing as SJW militias. He then said that cancel culture doesn't exist and it's hysteria to divide the working class. Here we can see him calling the upper class lizard people, which is one of the first steps to the dehumanization that will become an enthusiastic part of his rhetoric. He targets Elon Musk for forcing his workforce back to work, and would again make an attack on the rightist term snowflake. He would call this exploitation of the labor force. He says that the American people have no control over the healthcare system and expresses that politics is owned by a partisan duopoly. He then tells people to blame the system and get angry. In October 2022, he called for the use of violence in a thread on r/anarchism, saying that some windows might need to get broken. He would also use an anarchist joke about Marx and capitalism. In a post on r/public freakout, he says that police never care about the legality of things, only who pays them. He would cross-post a meme in r/workers strike back, taken from r/complete anarchy. I don't care if billionaires don't owe me anything. I'm taking it anyway. To which Aaron adds, they can pay me to not eat them. How about that? In a post made in r/anarchist literature, we can again see Aaron's partiality towards the African American left, where he talks about wanting to listen to Anarchism and the Black Revolution, written by Lorenzo Comboa Irvin, a prominent member of the Black Panther group. In r/union solidarity, he posted a topic about solidarity with prison workers called Solidarity with Prisoners. In r/workers strike back, Aaron posted an old socialist poem called And So the Bread is Conquered. In r/DankLeft, he posted a meme called Is It Too Early for Some Thanksgiving Dinner Discourse? And fortunately, as you can see, this meme was tagged with Death to America. The original post was apparently someone who made a meme about the whitewashing in the Avatar live-action movie by M. Night Shyamalan, so that briefly was a controversial casting choice where M. Night Shyamalan went and cast a couple of Euro-American actors as Inuit people. And the meme says, "Me, I promise I won't get political. Me, 3 drinks later. You and your forefathers have devastated the balance of this world, and now you will pay the ultimate price." But obviously, instead of being directed at the Avatar live-action movie, Aaron's now applying it to Thanksgiving and the political discussion around Thanksgiving that was happening in the anarchist and leftist community, of course. So, as we can basically now see, Aaron Bushnell is at the point where he's been convinced by anarchists not to believe in the political system, to see a violent workers' revolution as the only mechanism of social change, and to hate America and what it stands for, including anything about it. So, of course, the original idea behind Thanksgiving is that the Pilgrims and the Native Americans had a peace meal together, and that was the idea about Thanksgiving. So, it's celebrating peace. We all know that the peace didn't hold and that conflict arose after that. I guess it's essentially been historically seen as a nice gesture. You can also say that it's essentially just a harvest meal as well. So people being thankful for the harvest, that was common all across the world, and it remains common all across the world. But the problem is that Aaron Bushnell has been convinced of all of this to go and hate everything about America, to hate the political system. And he's done it, from what I can tell, in a year and a half. So just think about that. He's made this radical political transformation in a year and a half. Nowhere enough time that you would need to go and sit down and rationally think through things. No, this is someone who has very much outsourced their thoughts to other people, who has gone and said, okay, I'm going to be fine with letting YouTubers and various Reddits define what I think about things. I'm going to go and listen to a few anarchist books in the meantime. This is also not the sort of person who's going to have gone and looked at any of the critiques of those sorts of things. And that's, again, a sort of self-algorithmic bubble that you're going into, where you're saying, I'm only going to go and look at certain things because this is what I'm used to. This is what makes me comfortable. So, especially when you're going to see me doing the next part of this video, is I'm going to go out of my way and I'm going to go and look at a whole bunch of people that I absolutely despise, the vast majority of them, especially all of the influencers that I'm going to cover, and I'm going to tell you exactly why I despise those people. And the point is that I'm going to go and subject myself to those people because I need to know what they're thinking, and I need to know how do I respond to this to people who perhaps get trapped in those sorts of viewpoints themselves. How do I go and bust people out of thinking like that? And meanwhile, for those sorts of people, they're very rarely going to go and give any sort of discussion or debate to anyone who is outside their perspective. If they do, what you'll notice is that they lose so often. That's one of the things that is fascinating, where people who are in these self-enforced bubbles, when you finally get them to a point where they have to go and defend their ideas, they barely can, or they can't, because they haven't actually interacted with what other people have been critiquing about them. They've gone so used to the lazy idea of, oh, I'm going to be a bread tuber. Oh, look at me go and critique this Christian guy who's standing on the corner of the street and, blathering on about the end of the world, and then let's go see what he thinks about all these topics, blah, 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 and I'm going to go and refute someone like that. Very easy target to go and refute. Those sorts of people, they're going to go and come back at you. Well, the Bible says this, the Bible says that. Thing is, though, that so once you reject their premise, which is that the Bible is a reliable book, well, then you've gone and basically taken away any of their discussion ability, their ability to go and refute you. And if you're a breadtuber, none of the people there are going to go and believe in the Bible as a reliable book. So basically, they're going to be very easily able to go and refute them. But then if they were to go and debate someone like me, well, suddenly I'm going to go and expose all of their ideas for the psychological gibberish that they are. I'm going to go and be pulling stuff like all of the pseudo-religious ideas that they've got absorbed into themselves. I'm going to be doing all of this. That's not going to be an easy discussion to go and refute. That's going to be the hardest discussion of anyone's lives to go and try and refute what I'm saying. So, thing is, though, that if you don't go out of your way to go and look at what other people are saying, to go and critique them, well, then you're going to go and have a very rough time when any of your ideas become challenged. But of course, if you're someone who is based online and you're going and interacting with certain groups online, well, you're almost never going to go and run into people who disagree with you. And we're actually going to see what Aaron does when he runs into people who slightly disagree with him. In other words, people who are of the exact same political persuasion, essentially. And we're going to see how he goes and interacts with them. And it's not a very strong response. All right, we now get on to another interesting topic that speaks to Aaron's sexuality. Specifically, the fact that he clearly wasn't getting any. Like many young men on the spectrum, Aaron had difficulty in romance. He had difficulty finding a partner, and because of his background and his autism, he was very shy around women. We've seen earlier that he couldn't even really interact well with women online, and so to talk about how he's interacting with women in person is undoubtedly a lot worse. So the problem is that, like many young men on the spectrum, and like many people who are involved in the political extremist movements, what Aaron does is that he goes and comes up with a wild and bizarre solution that is very odd. It's not normal. It's very weird. So specifically, he got the idea that the reason he wasn't getting any women was because of the allegedly patriarchal system of relationships. So patriarchal relationships, for those who don't know, we'll go and take the old Roman system as an example of this. So in the Roman system, if you were married to a man, that man had full rights over the property that he and his wife collectively possessed. And in the event of a divorce, he had almost full rights over the property, and he had full rights over the children. This gets even a bit more intense in certain other cultures where you have ideas like women generally can't inherit titles or property. This is where, incidentally, you get that idea that women aren't persons legally speaking, because to be a person you have to be able to go and inherit property and that sort of thing. So it doesn't specifically have to do with how most laws would apply to women, but it would have to do with how inheritance laws apply to women. In certain societies, you have the idea of the bride price, which is that the husband literally goes and purchases the girl from her family, and then he goes and pays them a bride price, and so he's essentially purchased her from her father, so she's always possessed by a man somehow. And so these are the sort of systems that we would call patriarchal. In the most intense situations nowadays, I would say these occur in the Middle East. So in some areas of the Middle East, for example, you have polygamy that is legal, so where a man can marry up to 7 wives. I believe that is the typical Islamic custom. For those who are wondering how the old sultans and those types with their massive harems got around that idea? Well, that is because the Sultan was not technically legally married to most of the women in his harem. Oftentimes, he was only actually legally married to one woman, and she would be the one who produced his heirs in that. Slave women wouldn't count as, and concubines wouldn't count as towards that wife limit in Islam. It's not really a technically good way of approaching it because, of course, if you go back and look at how Muhammad originally went and put that into place, well, he put that into place because his forces were suffering pretty heavy losses in their expansion, and so he needed to go and keep the Arab women having husbands, and so that's why polygamy was so emphasized in that early form of Arabic expansion. And so we also have the issue that in our modern day society, a relationship patriarchy, as this describes, does not exist. So there are people who pretend in Western societies to have a patriarchal relationship in their family, so where the husband goes and decides everything for their family. Some women go along with that for whatever reason. Sometimes it's because they're from cultural areas that are still practicing that sort of relationship, such as the Middle East, or perhaps they have a very strict religious viewpoint. So in the case of certain Christians, for example, they might do something like that. But legally speaking, in the Western world, men and women in a relationship are deemed as equal parties. So there is no patriarchy in the West. There is no matriarchy in the West. The partners in a relationship are equal, meaning that if they split their relationship, they have equal rights to the property, 50-50. And then any children that they have to go through custody battles, and usually the idea is that if both parents are fitting, then the children are sort of split in their time between the parents. So, they'll stay over 1 week at the father's place, 1 week at the mother's place, or some sort of arrangement to that effect. Or a fit parent will always have the ability to go and see their children. So this is the problem to begin with these sorts of ideas. And then in terms of anything else that you might talk about with that might be patriarchal in a relationship, well, there's certainly the biological aspect that the man, of course, impregnates the woman, but this is what it is. This is biology, and of course, you're typically programmed in your genes and the chemicals in your mind to like that arrangement. So to be otherwise is to have an abnormal psychology, and one that is also not particularly conducive to reproduction as a general concept, and thus to the propagation of humanity as a consideration. Let's go and look, though, at what Aaron was posting in. Aaron posted in r/RelationshipAnarchy. RelationshipAnarchy. So this is going to be people who claim to apply anarchic principles to relationships. Let's see how r/RelationshipAnarchy describes itself. RelationshipAnarchy, sometimes abbreviated RA, is the application of anarchist principles to intimate relationships. Its values include autonomy, anti-hierarchical practices, anti-normativity, and community interdependence. RA is explicitly anti-amatonormative and anti-mononormative, and is commonly, but not always, non-monogamous. This is distinct from polyamory, solo poly, swinging, and other forms of dating, which may include structures such as amatonormativity, hierarchy, and rules. Alright, so to boil that down, what all of that very long spiel means, these are people who don't want any sort of rules in their relationships. The only rules that they want are presumably things that are self-determined, like I want to be treated this way or that in a relationship, and this is how I'm going to go and treat my body this way or that. Let's go and break this down. I'm going to begin with a very very specific annoyance that I have with so much of the internet. I talked earlier about the mentality of the hipster and the gender identitarian and all of the political extremists. These people, by and large, have an obsession with not being normal. They consider not being normal as being special, as being superior to being normal. This is why we have all of this anti-normal slang on the internet. So we have normies, we have sheeple, vanilla to describe them, the boring flavor. Debatable, of course. Some people actually like vanilla as a flavor and it can be kind of cool. But this is what they're talking about. So we want to be something with pizzazz, to be special, to be different. And in doing so, they all go and create these little blobs on the internet, these little micro identities. They go and set themselves against what's being considered as normal. One of the reasons why they've done this is because, going back to that idea of social disillusionment in society, a lot of people now don't feel very connected to a lot of things that are intrinsic to their lives. So you go and look at what people think about their countries. Oftentimes they're very mixed, or they feel very depressed about the current state of their countries. In particular, again, we're dealing with people on the internet who have, generally speaking, much more extreme viewpoints than people in reality. And so you're going to see these sorts of sentiments much more commonly expressed. But we also have to note that younger people use the internet a lot more. And so they're going to go and see people expressing these sentiments, and then they might go and decide to go and ape them. And this could be encouraged for very young people, for example, if they don't like that they're spending 5 days a week in school, don't like that they're spending 8 hours a day in school. These could be the sort of things that cause them to be annoyed with general society and to think, well, screw it. I'm seeing this guy on the internet who's talking about, oh, you should be depressed about society and this reason and this reason and this reason. This makes sense. And of course, that's because they're being exposed to these sorts of people without having any sort of intellectual foundation to go and critically examine them and refute them. So, the obvious truth, however, is this. These people who consider themselves to be special and awesome and blah-de-blah-de-blah on the internet, very rarely are they actually so. It is the normal person that goes out there and makes society work. And they're very often condemned for it. Back when we had aristocrats running around, they condemned normal people as peasants, as lower than them. And this is despite the fact that these were the people who were making society work. The aristocrats may have commanded people in various different circumstances, but the reality is that it is normal people who made society work, and it still continues to be normal, average people who make society work. Normal people go out there, they drive the trucks that power the supply chain, they tend to patients in hospitals, they grow your food, they stock shelves at the local supermarket, they mine all of the resources that go into creating your various devices. Ordinary people make the world go round. Meanwhile, the average person who rants on the internet all day long about how much they hate the normies and all of their brainwashed obsession with going and conforming to society, and look at me, look how great I am for not conforming, look how different I am, look how special I am. What are their accomplishments? What are their actual accomplishments? Because you can go and rant at normal people all day, you can say that you think they're stupid. Are they? No, they make society go round. They're doing something that is incredibly useful. What are you doing? What are you doing when you're ranting at them? Especially if you're in such a place of privilege where you don't have to go and work one of these hard jobs. So let's cut it out with this sort of superiority complex about I'm not normal. Oh, look at me, I'm superior. And this is extremely relevant when what we're talking about here as well. Like, the normal person and their sexual habits, which is getting married, having kids, these are people that are propagating the human species. They're doing a very good thing in doing that. And a lot of these people who complain about them, who bitch at them, what do they call people? They call normal people like that breeders. These people, they don't have accomplishments even in the area of propagating humanity. Instead, they go to constant lengths to go and tell themselves, oh, I'm so great, I'm so grand, I'm better than you, I'm better than all the regular people, all the standard people. They're all vanilla. Oh, they're all boring, 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 boring. You act like a sex god when you're like, oh, my neighbor has 6 kids. Look how terrible they are at having sex. Meanwhile, here's me and my fling of the week, and here I have a bunch of weird kinky sex all over the place, and I'm just a sex god. Oh, look at me, I'm so superior. You've completely missed out the purpose of what you're supposed to be doing in society. The point of an intellectual in society, of someone who is taking on the role of a social leader, is that they're supposed to go and help normal people to go and live their lives even better. They're not supposed to be these sorts of arrogant people who are always going on about how flawed and how terrible normal people are. A lot of arrogant people have done that throughout the years, throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia. You always have someone who wants to go and see themselves as superior just because they think in certain categories. But this is not true. We should not be having these sorts of, I hate normal people, I think I'm superior to normal people. If you're an intellectual leader, you're just different than normal people. You're not better than them. In a lot of ways, you have to strictly consider, is what you're doing even more advantageous to society than what the normal person is doing? And see, this is part of our modern day culture too, right? So you have all of these celebrities that are running around here and there, here and there, here and there. Yes, they create entertainment for people. Things that people go and use to go and take their mind off of things, to go and enjoy themselves. This is a valid part of society. Let's not say that it isn't. But then to act like the person who is doing that is somehow superior to a normal person, especially in their perspectives, absolutely not the case. Like, your average entertainer is not a deep thinker. Even your average day writer is not a very deep thinker, despite the fact that writing is supposed to be an art that is highly psychological, that psychologically analyzes characters. So let's cut out with the anti-normativity. Let's talk about the principles that they're advocating for here. First up, community interdependence. All families are dependent upon the community. Families go and participate in community activities. It is rare to see a family that doesn't try and do this. Schools are a communal activity in our society. People participate in schools. And so then to talk about community interdependence, that's a very odd way of framing it, because people have their friends, and oftentimes friends will do stuff like, oh, I'll take your kids off of you for a few days while you and your partner go out and do whatever you wish to do alone. That's one way that people help out. Grandparents, very often there for their grandkids. So community interdependence does exist. It's just, it doesn't exist in the sort of absolutist way that these anarchists want to. Anarchists want to be an old school tribe, which is basically where in the modern times they conceive of turning their neighborhoods into essentially tribal communities where lots of people are interlinked and doing stuff together. This actually does exist in certain areas. Like at the moment, I talk with a bunch of my neighbors all the time, help out with a bunch of the neighbors all the time. So that's just to say that we should be very careful in saying that these sort of community interlinks don't exist. It's just, they don't necessarily exist in modern day society. I've already dealt with anti-normativity, anti-hierarchical practices. I'm also now going to talk about promoting non-monogamous relationships. The reason why you have a non-monogamous relationship is because you want to go and sleep around with a whole bunch of other people. it's not because you want to have a cohesive and healthy family environment. Now, let's talk about the importance of a cohesive family environment, okay? When you're raising children, it's important to give them a structured life where there is consistency. And you might be wondering, well, why can't I just go and switch out partners here and there and here and there? Because children get very emotionally attached to very specific parts of their life. So everyone has a childhood pet that they have. Everyone has a childhood friend and their parents that they have. And they're very attached to these things. So let's just talk about this non-monogamous bit for a moment. Imagine, for example, if you went up to a kid and you're like, okay, every year I'm going to go and switch out your dog. How much of a relationship would you then have with each dog? Well, you would not end up having a good relationship with each dog. You would just have the mindset of, oh, this dog's going to come and it's going to go after a year. It's exactly the same sort of issue that we get into when we're talking about non-monogamy. And this is even before we talk about the whole genetical concept of the whole thing. So now let's address what they're seeking to do with this non-monogamous bit. So guys like Aaron say, I'm a little bit below average, right? Aaron's not an ugly guy, but I would say that he is in that 4 out of 10, 4.5 out of 10 range. So slightly below average. It's not necessarily a relationship killer. But it does make things hard in modern day when a lot of relationships, especially if you're someone who is socially awkward, would be handled online. And of course, all those online dating sites and online dating apps are notorious for being very bad for average and slightly below average men, because essentially it's a lot harder to go and get dates on those things than it would be if you actually knew women in real life. But the point is that, so people that are below average then think, okay, well, maybe if women were just less monogamous, well, then maybe I'd get some more. Maybe I'd have a chance at getting a woman. So I'll go and promote this concept of non-monogamy and I'll see how it goes and turns out. Problem. When women are in a non-monogamous situation, when they can go and have sex with any man that they want and they can do it on a casual level, they're not going to go and choose the standard or lower than standard men. They're going to go and choose the higher tier men. So all that you've done by going and saying, I'm going to have a non-monogamous society, is that you've gone and committed to the higher tier men getting more women, which means that there's actually going to be less women for the average and especially the below average man. And so you can see that this principle of non-monogamy is entirely self-defeating. And it's also self-defeating for the women in these relationships, because if you're non-monogamous, then you as a woman have to go and compete with a bunch of other women for the more desirable men's attention and time, which means that there's a bunch of women competing for a limited pool of men at any given time. This also means that you do not have the sort of emotional relationships that many women love, which is something, of course, that relationship anarchy, this is the sort of concept that you can see was almost certainly invented by a man, even if there's some women who advocate for it. Women get extremely intense in their emotional relationships that they have with men. And this is one of the things that women also like: stability. They also like things that don't have extreme change. And why is this? Well, because if a man sticks around and helps to provide for his family, that is giving the best experience for the children in that relationship. The children in that relationship then have a consistent paternal father who they can go and talk to and who they can go and learn things from and who will provide for them. Without that, the women have much less stability. They then have to go and seek out various other ways to go and support their children. And for the man himself, a man should want to go and see his offspring succeed. See, human men are different from animals. With most animals, the male animals don't care about their offspring. What they'll do is they'll go and have sex with the female animal, and then they'll go and essentially putter around, and it'll be up to the female animal to go and raise them entirely, those children that result from that entirely. And the only time that the male will ever really get involved is if he has to go and potentially defend a flock or a partner of his. And so you then see the much more communal sorts of animals. So, for example, like a bird or a wolf pair. And these sorts of animals will provide mutually for their children. They'll go and mutually defend them, mutually care for them. And this idea is better than the male who just goes and doesn't care because he's going and breeding with a bunch of different females. Because it gets you a lot more. Well, it basically is the way that a lot more skills get transferred down to the young of those relationships. And it's the same with humans. And we have another thing to add with humans, that human men, just like women, are interested in getting their genes propagated. The reason that men and women have sexual desires is fundamentally at its core, at its most biological core, to go and propagate their genetics. And you could say that people don't really care about that in a lot of cases, that they just want to go in for the heck of it to feel the sensations. Fine, that's true. A lot of people are like that. But biologically, at the fundamental core, we contribute to the tree of life that has been going on for billions of years on this planet. And we continue it as the highest expression of a life form that has come on that planet. And so you can say that you will not breed, that you won't have kids. That is your decision. But it's important to note that continuing to propagate one's genes is important. It's not for everyone. I respect that there are people who are genetically inclined to homosexuality who wouldn't want to have children, or some homosexuals do want to have children, but perhaps we're talking about the majority who don't. That's fine, that happens. There are also persons who, for various reasons, shouldn't have kids, so people with very severe genetic illnesses that can be passed on to their children. So there are those sorts of people. And so those sorts of people, of course, for the general good of society, they don't have kids. But most people are genetically inclined to have kids, and this is what would be considered to be normative. And so in saying that you're going to go against that normative impulse, you're going to have to go and argue with life itself, and you're going to have a very tough time going and arguing why a creature that is at the pinnacle of existence, that is at the pinnacle of the tree of life, that is, as far as we know, the best sort of creature that this planet has ever produced, you're going to have a very hard time arguing why that creature should not have an interest in furthering and propagating its genes. And so why I bring that up in terms of this idea of monogamy is because women do not have to be, strictly speaking, concerned about this when they have kids, right? A woman always has the child. She knows that she always is passing her genes onto her child. The only exception to that would be surrogacy, but a woman is, of course, going to know if she's been implanted with surrogates, etc. A man, on the other hand, does not know if his genes are getting passed along to a specific woman. And this is one of the biggest reasons why, biologically speaking, monogamy has come about. And you see this all the time in the wild, right? Animals fight to go and get the females interested in them. They go and show that they're worthy of going and breeding with them. So from a male point of view, the male is interested in a woman being sexually specific to that male. And you can say there are ways around this in modern day society. We have genetic testing, for example, that can go and see whose child a certain baby is. We can go and see the paternity of that child. However, the point is that monogamy is designed so that the greatest amount of men know who their kids are, they know that they're propagating their genes, and they can go out into society and do that. Under other systems, we either have a case of where, in the case of a polyamorous society, we would have there being no idea of who a woman's children are from. So no idea of who their father is, and thus no responsibility for that father to go and tend for them. And under a society that is polygamous, we have an extreme restriction on which men are actually going to go and further their genes. So generally speaking, that would reduce the number of men who would be capable of having kids and knowing that they'd have kids. So what you can see here is that monogamy, it goes and gives children a very good and consistent life growing up. It gives them the parents that are both providing for them. All this is just to say that the reason why people are in monogamy, why monogamy is extremely common in basically the vast majority of societies, and why female exclusivity is common in almost all societies, is because men have the right to go and propagate themselves just as do women. The sexual contract, the voluntary sexual contract, is that the woman will carry a child for the man that she is having sex with. And this is what happens when it's an agreed upon thing, and this is what we call love, that you're helping to propagate the genetic code of another person and bring that part of their genetic code into the future. Is the tree of humanity, the branch of humanity on the tree of life. So when you talk about overthrowing this and saying that, oh, this is normie stuff, this is boring. No, this is a very elegant concept that has been philosophically determined over thousands and thousands and thousands of years, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of years. And if you're going to go and challenge a normative thing about society, you have to go and provide extremely good reasons for doing that. You know, I oftentimes see people who can go and say, oh, this little tribal group over here, well, they go and do things a bit differently than everyone else in the world. But if you're going and introducing an idea just because there is a slight precedent for it, so there might be a society out there that is polyamorous somewhere, it's going to be in the vast, vast, vast minority of all human societies. And so to then go and say that this is going to be equally as valid as something that has been practiced by the vast, vast, vast majority of human societies, you're going to have to go and provide a very strict reason why that extreme minority position should be practiced by other people. And it's going to have to be one that can go and stand up to the scientific test, that you can go and say, this is why this is scientifically better than this other action. And we know that having tons of sexual partners is not scientifically good for people or society, because it can go and very easily spread various forms of sexually transmitted diseases. And that does not help society. That is a concern of society. Because if you're going out there and then you're potentially going and getting infected by someone that you're having sex with, well, it becomes another thing that doctors have to go and deal with on top of all of the other stuff that doctors have to go and deal with. So the point being, sometimes we've had things change in our society. So in terms of casual sex, for example, we went and developed a bunch of techniques to go and allow that to happen. So before, for example, birth control was a thing, well, that meant that only men could go out and have casual sex with random women and then be sure that they're consequence free after doing that. Legally speaking, we try to constrain those men with paternity tests and with having paternal obligations to their children via alimony, but there were still a ton of men who managed to go and slip out from that without having to pay the consequences for their actions. A woman always had to have caution about her sexual intercourse because a woman can always get pregnant from a sexual act. This isn't technically true biologically, but a woman doesn't know the exact days when she can go and get pregnant biologically speaking. So it's usually a certain number of days per month when a woman can get pregnant, and then it's like a 25 to 30% chance that a woman could get pregnant on those exact days. So the point though is that the act of sex always holds a risk for a woman, and that's why women are much more picky about their relationships, and this is a biological thing. And so what birth control and condoms and this sort of thing have allowed women to do is to go out and have sexual relationships that are comparable to the ones that men could have had. So essentially, women can be psychologically male in their sexual activities, I suppose you could say. It still doesn't mean that a lot of the normative desires go away for children and that sort of thing, but we have essentially gone and scientifically done that. And of course, we've also technically done the same thing with men with stuff like vasectomies, where men can go and get their tubes tied and then not be able to go and impregnate women, and then they can just go and have sex basically however many times they'd want. But the undesirable element of that is that you of course then have to deal with the sexually transmitted diseases that occur, and so you have safe sex programs that are designed to go and put those in place. And so just the issue is that there's so many things to go and consider in society. But the point is that once you go and commit to having children, there's a specific set way that is a very good way of going about it, that provides the most standard, most loving, and most intact system for children. And it provides the most generalized version of that so that the highest number of people can go and participate in that. Because, of course, humans, generally speaking, have about a 50-50 ratio of boys and girls. So when you want to go and say, I'm going to go and void that, well, you're going to go and have to have a very, very good reason for doing that. And claiming that, oh, relationships are now patriarchal. Well, relationships are at the biological level the least patriarchal they've ever been. Women have the most ability to go and control what happens to them sexually speaking. We have no patriarchy in our familial context, where relationships, legally speaking, are 50-50. And so anything beyond that is simply about the psychological dynamic between partners. And generally speaking, as far as that goes, well, some people are going to feel more comfortable in a leading role, others are going to feel more comfortable in a subordinate role, and that's just going to be how people are psychologically. And there's going to be relationships where that's going to go and factor in different ways, and different genders are going to go and hold those positions in them. And finally, I want to just go and say, look at the way that this allegedly anarchic, power to the people idea promotes itself. Let's look at some of these words. Amato-normative. Do you know what that means without going into a dictionary and looking it up? I tell you that your average person, no chance they know that word. Anti-mononormative. Again, absolutely no idea what that means without going and looking at it in the dictionary. As a matter of fact, we have, let me count them out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At least 6 ideas expressed in the middle part of that RelationshipAnarchy blurb that people would have to go and look up in the dictionary if you're talking to an average person. So what does this tell us? Well, this tells us that this is not the sort of idea that is being aimed at general people. This is an idea that is highly, highly elitist. If you've ever read a rather fantastic article from George Orwell called Politics and the English Language, you'll know that one of the things that he noted was a very bad trait of political language in his day was its tendency to use extremely long words that had foreign origins, specifically coming out of places like Greece, France, Latin, etc. These words like amatonormative, anti-mononormative. Well, for starters, these are extremely constructed words. These are not words that are being used generally in English language society. And these are words that are being used with the intent of giving the person who is using them a elitist idea, the idea that they're politically better than other people, simply because they can go and sprout out a bunch of words that the average person will not be able to know without going and looking them up. And to persons like this sort of lingual elitism becomes something that leads into actual elitism, as we've seen. Anti-normativity. So they don't like what is normal. They want to go and promote themselves using these words. They're designed so that only a small percentage of the people who read them actually know what they mean, people who are already in this sort of subgroup. And this is why I'm going to go and call this sort of anarchism elitism. I consider this to be a Reddit that is formed of elitist snobs who are trying to justify obsessively crude and lustful sexual desires. And even as anarchists claim that they're drawing their principles out from primitive society, which is the point of anarchism, in case you didn't know. Anarchists say that they're going and reviving the principles of primitive society, which were much more egalitarian. They were much freer. They were much more democratic. People had less of an emphasis on property. These are the sorts of things that especially the left anarchists would talk about wanting to go and revive and bring into modern society and to model modern society after that, rather than civilization, which is hierarchical, and civilization typically being defined by hierarchies. However, even as they claim to be trying to replicate the forms of primitive relationships, they actually aren't. They don't have evidence that these sorts of things were present in primitive societies. We can go and look at a bunch of primitive societies. Our anthropologists, during the time of colonialism, managed to encounter a number of primitive societies and then record how they acted and how they were. So they got things like the religious beliefs of those societies. They got things recorded such as the social characteristics, and those social characteristics included how that society viewed marriage and sexuality and all of these sorts of traits. And so what these people are trying to put into place isn't how ancient peoples, how primitive peoples thought. Instead, they are trying to go and put in place these sorts of modern forms where we now suddenly have women being able to act entirely different than they've been able to act historically. And then they're going and saying, we're going to go and retroactively call that primitive societies, when it's not all the case. Primitive women were known for being more open to promiscuous behavior, but you also need to know that that did come at the cost of when that woman got pregnant, engaging in said promiscuous behavior. The man who impregnated her was expected to go and step up and claim that child and then go and care for the woman. And if he failed to do that, then he was going to be extremely shamed in that village. So, point was, there were things that in primitive societies that you could do that were not generally practiced in the civilized countries. Another one that I can think of is that we talk about the idea of gender norms. So, again, bring back to the idea of transgenderism that has been promoted recently. It's the idea that primitive societies oftentimes had third genders in that. So, I'll just tell you about some of the alternative genders that I've come across in my anthropological readings of various places. So, amongst some Native Americans, and I do want to stress some here because there are a lot of different Native Americans, and you should not go and stereotype them all as having one viewpoint on society when they have very diverse societies. We have the idea that's sometimes been called the two-spirited person. This isn't something that I would exactly consider accurate, since I consider that sort of language more valid when we're talking about shamans and the idea of shamans having an attachment to very specific spirits. So, to give you a Western example of a shamanic person that I would consider to have that sort of perspective. And the point of shamans in that case is that shamans who are attached to spirits would sometimes go and outwardly express their sexuality, their gender, in terms of the most powerful spirit that they were regarded as being in contact with. So, to give you actually an interesting Western example of this, if we go and look at Joan of Arc, or Jeanne d'Arc as the French would know her, well, she claimed to have been in contact with three spirits. And for those wondering why I'm regarding a Catholic girl as the same as a shamanic experience, well, it's because the experiences are identical. It's just the religious context that they're being expressed in is a little bit different, but they're going to have the same psychological impact. So with Joan of Arc, what happened is that she claimed to have been in contact with two female saints and the archangel Michael, who Michael is oftentimes regarded as being the manifestation of Jesus, for those who don't know that. This isn't something that is 100% agreed upon in Christianity. Some people see Michael as Jesus, others see him as the leader of the angels, but regardless, it just means that the most powerful spirit that Joan of Arc was involved with was male. And so it's no coincidence then that her outward expression was that she wore male clothing, cut her hair in a male type. She still called herself a woman. She never said she wasn't a woman, but she cross-dressed. And this was because of being in contact with this most powerful male spirit. And importantly, it was a cross-dressing that was a religious obligation to her. So when she's being held in captivity in the tower, the jailers are constantly trying to force her to go and wear female clothing, and she is constantly refusing because it is a religious obligation for her to go and wear male clothing. And so at one point they do get her to go and dress up in a women's dress again, and then they come back the next morning and she is again dressed up in her male clothing, and then she is tells them bluntly that it's a religious obligation and that she was stupid for doubting that it was a religious obligation, which means that Joan of Arc at least believed then that she was talking with a spirit at that time, who then told her its displeasure at being treated like that. And so my point is that one of the concepts of having multiple spirits within you, of this whole two-spirited idea, is that you are sharing your body with another spirit, and then you then can express yourself as being one with this spirit by going and comparing yourself in some part with the gender of the spirit that you're attached to. This does, of course, have a bit of a darker side also, because of course I've also read of shamans, for example, who consider themselves to be linked to female spirits, and then were dressing as women, and then felt really embarrassed about it, and then uh, they then came to the conclusion that, well, they would only go and dress up in women's clothing while they were going and doing their religious ceremonies, and then otherwise they'd go and be dressed up as a man. So that's how they went and explained that to themselves. Some primitive peoples believed that wearing a certain type of clothing imparted a spirit to you, a psychological tendency. So, for example, if we go to the Aztecs, one of the famous Aztec orders is the Jaguar Warrior. The Jaguar Warrior wore a pad armor that had a Jaguar style cape, sometimes even more of the Jaguar as a sort of suit. And they regard this as imparting the ferocious spirit of the Jaguar unto themselves by going and dressing themselves in the skin of a Jaguar. It was similar with the concept of the Aztec Eagle Warrior, where they would go and dress themselves up in bright, colorful uniforms of feathers, and then they would impart the speed and the strength of an eagle to themselves. And both of these were considered to be the knightly orders of the Aztecs. And you find this idea in a whole bunch of other places in the world. And this is entirely the same when we go and talk about gender as far as it goes in Native American cultures. So we have to understand that in these societies, labor was gendered. So men did certain tasks, women did certain tasks. And this was something that wasn't almost ever violated. Like, men almost always did male tasks, women almost always did female tasks. So male tasks will include hunting, going to war, fishing, and these sorts of things, whereas the women were more like the industrialists. So they go and make pots and weave clothing, make clothing. They go and attend to the fields, gather firewood, these sorts of things. Males would handle the construction of buildings in the village and this sort of thing. So this is how gendered labor worked inside a typical primitive society. But what we get is that there's a few wrenches that we have to throw in here. So occasionally you'll get women who are allowed to go and participate in things like wars. They do so, though, with the strict rules that they cannot be pregnant or engage in sexual intercourse while they're engaged as a male warrior. So that's something that exists there. That's also, I should mention, a very infrequent thing to see in typical cultures. You will, however, hear about women who are shamans who will sometimes lead soldiers into battle, and then because they are regarded as having the gift of prophecy and of being leaders in that sense, so that can sometimes happen. But the other wrench that we have to consider here is that we've talked about the male as being very tough, and Native American men were notoriously very, very tough, and they had very strict rituals about how they went and initiated young men into manhood. But what about a man who is severely autistic? I'm not talking about this in the teehee I'm autistic way of the internet. I'm talking about this entirely bad at hunting, would probably be extremely frightened of being in combat. This is not someone who would make a good typical man. And so what these societies did is that they went and took these men who were called, they were portrayed as being laughing, silly, wanting to go and play games with women all day. So they went and took these men, and then they went and dressed them in women's clothing, and then they regarded that as psychologically imparting the spirit of a woman upon them, and then they would employ them in women's activities. There's also a very much a darker aspect of this, though, which is that the same often happened with prisoners of war who were made into slaves. So they take male captives and then they go and dress them in women's clothing and employ them in women's tasks that would intentionally humiliate them. And that way they would break their will. They would essentially mock them and make fun of them. And they would mock them as having a imparted female spirit to them because they were being forced to wear women's clothing. This also incidentally happened amongst the Turkish peoples of Central Asia. And we see another aspect of this, which is it doesn't even have to be a sort of clothing that you force people to wear. So in China, when they got conquered by the Manchus under the Qing Empire, the Qing forced all of the Han Chinese men to go and wear their hair in a sort of pigtail style that was based off of the standard Mongolian hairstyle. And they did that as a way to remind them, to force them to bear a symbol of who was ruling over them, which was a Mongolian group. And so this is why the Chinese, if you ever talk to a Han Chinese person, they absolutely despise that whole stereotype that you sometimes see in the old television and that where the Chinese character has that sort of forced ponytail, because that is something that is very much loathed by the Chinese. They always hated it. So very interesting stuff, which is just the point to say that we in our modern day, I think we know, generally speaking, what's happening here, right? So we can't definitively say that, there is this metaphysical world or there isn't a metaphysical world. But we can say that a lot of this stuff sounds this idea that you're in contact with spirits, that you're possessed by spirits that sometimes talk through different parts of your mind. We can say that this does have definitive traces of a sort of schizophrenia, of multiple personalities. And this is likely what was being expressed by these persons. So they're acting very differently, very oddly from society. It's oftentimes been said that you can spot a shaman just by looking at them. And so I would say this is, generally speaking, what is happening with those. And again, whether you believe that potentially there could be a spiritual element to some of these, this will be up to your personal beliefs regarding certain things. But generally speaking, I think we can agree that this does sound like mostly schizophrenia that we're dealing with here. Which is all that to say, just because you hear about something in a primitive society that has gendered labor, you should be extremely careful about going and applying that to modern society. So that rationale for having this group of autistic men who are dressed as women and then go and act in womanly roles and that sort of thing, that does not exist in a society that is not gender determined in the vast majority of its professions. And ours is, of course, such a society, which is one of the things that annoys me about the fact that gender has become this massive talking point that everyone wants to go and promote, because people have been looking at society absolutely falsely. They've been talking about how it's, this, patriarchal, or this and that, and this and that, when the reality is that our society is extremely gender neutral in the vast majority of its aspects. You can go and do almost anything you want as a man or as a woman. You can go and act however you want, including sexually act however you want as a man or a woman. But the issue is that people have gone and chosen to instead go and obsess over what a hyper stereotypical man or a hyper stereotypical woman looks like. And of course, I think we should be able to recognize that the traits that are usually classified as masculine or feminine, they can go and occur at different they occur at different percentages typically in the sexes, but they aren't exclusive to one sex or the other. So that's all just to say that we should be much more inclined to practice individualization than we are to go and practice the sort of forced conformity on these matters. And now let's get to the actual video that Aaron posted on the subreddit, the relationship anarchism. So comparing relationship parts to a honeycomb. It's the illusion that's being drawn. This video by the female YouTuber Anrel describes itself as relationships have blueprints and those blueprints are inadequate at best. I put together a little chart thing based off of a relationship anarchy smorgasbord to help with that. And she's apparently tied somewhat into Andrewism. So Andrewism, if you go to this video, commented on it, and she thanks him later on in the description of it. All right, so that's essentially what Aaron's been looking at as far as relationships go, and it's not going and taking him in a very good place. This is followed a little while after by a cross post talking about the Texas drag show controversy, specifically advocating for allies, and this was in r/anti-fascists of Reddit. So once more interest in the gender spectrum stuff coming from Aaron. Then we come to two interesting posts. First, he commented on a meme post titled, "Won't someone think of the exploiters?" with, "May I live? Are you poor? Then no. Wow, rich people are mean. Wow, bigotry. Help, help, I'm being oppressed." So, of course, the conversation between a poor person and a rich person, the rich person who then says that they're being oppressed, and the poor person comes to the conclusion that rich people are mean. A more substantial post was made on a topic called How to Turn Your Neighborhood into a Village. And on this topic, Aaron comments, "I've realized that a lot of the difference between me and my less radical friends is that they are less capable of imagining a better world than I am. I follow YouTubers like Andrewism that fill my head with concrete images of free post-scarcity communities, and it makes me much more prepared to reject things about the current world, because I've imagined how things could be, and that helps me see how extremely bullshit things are right now. What I'm trying to say is this. It's so important to imagine a better world. Let your thoughts run wild with idealistic dreams of what the world should look like, and let the pain and anger at how it's not that way flow through you. Let it free your mind and fuel your rage against the machine. It's not too late for you or anyone. We can have the world of our dreams tomorrow, but we have to be willing to fight today." Of course, this is where we have to comment on the problems with idealism. Idealism is based on the idea that there are perfect worlds or perfect systems that humans can arrive at. This was first proposed by the philosopher Plato, who suggested that there was a realm of ideals where the perfect idea of everything existed. So the ideal cat exists somewhere out there. The ideal image of a dog exists, and these things are more real than reality itself. The problem, of course, is that Plato was just speaking nonsense when he came up with the idea of Platonic forms. He was arriving at this conclusion with philosophical reasoning, but just because you can say that something is logical philosophically does not therefore mean that it logically exists, that it actually exists. So let's talk about how this is applied to the ideas that Aaron was filling his head with. Society is likely capable of achieving a post-scarcity state at this point in time, at least in terms of energy and food, given the population of people in developed countries. However, that comes with the qualification that anarchic systems are utterly incapable of overseeing a technologically advanced society such as would be necessary to enter into such a post-scarcity state. And the problem with fighting to rip down institutions instead of changing them democratically is that any sort of revolution always leaves a country in tatters, which is especially dangerous in the modern day when there are so many forces in the world that are ready to eagerly swoop down to exploit any social chaos for their advantage, both foreign and domestic. It's here that I would say an idea that's important to remember whenever you get too idealistic about things. There's no such thing as perfection, and everything is a process. Perfection ultimately only exists in abstract systems. 1 plus 1 is perfect in terms of math, but if we look at reality, we know that 1 plus 1 does not exist. Reality is so much more complicated than can be expressed in that simple little abstraction. We see things that we abstractly consider as one entity, but in reality, these are made of tons and tons and tons of different forces and particles. They're pulling at one another, they're influencing one another in different ways, and that thing that we consider as one entity, for example, one lamp, is itself going to be influenced by so many other things that we would consider to also be singular entities, but which are ultimately intermingled. So just because we conceive of something as perfect in the abstract sense does not therefore mean that that abstraction can be applied to reality. And it's the same way with political systems. We can come up with excellent political systems in our head that we think will work out brilliantly, but what truly matters is if we can show that these systems can be applied in practicality. Of course, every system that we say can be applied in practicality must first be conceived of abstractly, which is the difficulty of this matter of ours. So just to give another example, to reach our current state at the height of life on Earth, humanity being the height of life on Earth, there were many things that came before us which were lesser, imperfect. They might have been excellent expressions of life at their time, however millions of years ago they existed. However, they were flawed in comparison to us. They were not as rich creatures as us. And this is the same way that humanity will eventually likely be regarded in the same way in the far future when another sort of creature arises who will become, as Nietzsche once so eloquently put it, a race that will make man look like a monkey in comparison. And that's a race indeed which we should all want to see come to exist. So perfection doesn't exist. All that truly exists is the process of becoming ever greater. Aristotle's idea of a sleeping god who goes and brings the universe into existence and then is content to dream of it as the universe goes and sorts itself out, instead of Plato's idea of a god who is the totality of everything, has already conceived of the best possible thing in every single situation. No, things are in the process of becoming, not looking up to something that already exists and thinking how much weaker and more pathetic they are in comparison to that ideal. And so to look upon the advances that representative democracy has made and to toss it all out because it is not the perfectly ideal system is flawed. It's a completely flawed idea. Instead, we should recognize that representative democracy is a stepping stone to a better evolution of political discourse. It was brought into existence largely in part because of technological constraints at the time. So back when democracies were first considered, the reality is not everyone in a country could go and gather in the same place and give their opinion on legislation that was happening. So the idea was then that every community would go and send out 1 or 2 representatives, and then these representatives would go and travel to the capital and meet with a whole bunch of other representatives, and then that would essentially represent the will of the community. It's an imperfect idea because, of course, Just because you vote for someone does not mean that you will then go and hold to all of their propositions. So, in other words, they are not necessarily representative of your opinion. And then, of course, if your guy loses, technically you're also not represented. So, these are the issues with representative democracy as a concept in large part. So, the interesting thing, though, is that we nowadays have instantaneous communication. And what this has done is that it has technically removed much of that limited justification for representative democracy. And in the future, I predict that this will lead to a point where the political class and people will have to declare either for direct democracy, taking full advantage of instantaneous communication, or for more oligarchic forms, a rejection of democracy. So in the West, I'd like to see us go towards that democratic future. And obviously, in a lot of places around the world, we see these phony fake elections in places like Russia, for example, where Putin just goes and tosses out his political opponents or goes and defrauds the system in other ways. And so this is a person who does not believe in democracy. He believes in oligarchy and autocracy. And this is true of many other places that claim to have a democracy. So Venezuela is another one that comes to mind, which of course also has a fake quote-unquote democracy. But this is the idea of the evolution of things, where things can go. But we should not go and say that simply because things were less ideal in the past that they were therefore bad. You know, just in the same way that we don't go and look at our hominid ancestors 3-4 million years ago and say, oh, those were bad creatures at that time. Well, no, they were very good creatures at that time. It's just they're lesser than us. And to go and continue with this idea of evolution and how we should regard it against the concept of perfected idealism, I want to bring up a fascinating historical document, a historical address that all of you will have heard of before, but perhaps you've not thought of it in this way. Abraham Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address, made the following statement: 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. This is, of course, a very famous statement. It is the denial of everything that the Confederacy believed in. The Confederacy, of course, held that only white people were to have full rights in their system and that blacks were not to have rights, that blacks weren't created equal, that blacks were cursed, as some of their theologians attempted to justify the state of their slavery. And Lincoln says, no, at its core, the idea of America is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, Lincoln was well aware that many of the founding fathers, perhaps even the majority of the founding fathers, were slaveholders. He was well aware of this when he made this statement. America, after Lincoln's death, would continue to not understand the meaning of this idea as it pursued violent conquest of the Plains natives, following the plan of Manifest Destiny. So we're well aware of the hypocrisies inherent in people who claimed that proposition. But the genius of Lincoln's speech is to recognize that the founding fathers were men who set forth an idea that had power and was worth seeing through to its finish, to its logical conclusion, even if the founding fathers themselves were incapable of realizing the meaning of the statement of the proposition in its totality. The proposition that all men are created equal, the proposition of democracy over monarchy, remains true even as the men who wrote those words did not comprehend their full meaning. And just as America has grown and matured, coming to understand the meaning of that idea more and more, so too do we reach inflection points. Today we see countless people talk of rejecting this idea. There are conservatives who scornfully loathe the idea of democracy, instead hailing the establishment of a republic with all of its oligarchic trappings. And the left has so many wannabe oligarchs who talk of how individuals are fictional and that the people have too much freedom. And whatever the ideology or ideas that are put forth to justify these sentiments, they always boil down to the idea that people aren't equal. Some people are better than others and deserve more power and influence. It doesn't matter the substance of that argument, whether aristocratic blood, possession of credentials and titles, religious initiation, or any of the other multitude of ways that one person declares superiority and rights over another. The proposition is either held or rejected. As the idea that proposition shines more true, so do those who have always had contempt for it reveal themselves from behind their false-faced masks. The sentiment that will bring forth the world of tomorrow isn't about revolutionary rage or anger, bareness or hostility. Revolution was never the truth of humanity. It was always an interruption. Wasn't the original revolution the institution of taboos overseen by a particular class? See, imagining the future that democracy might bring, you're not a revolutionary. You're a counter-revolutionary against the fake ideas that justified oligarchic control throughout history. And it is those ideas that were put in place with bitterness, cynicism, and revolutionary intent. To counter those ideas, you don't embrace revolution. You embrace the idea that human ideas are a continuity and that we need to get back to honoring that continuity. The revolution is utterly incompatible with the idea of Aristotelian progress, of humans figuring out ways that make society and culture work while a slumbering God dreams of them. This is what the Enlightenment believed progress to be, what Lincoln and all the others believed progress to be. Instead, we find people who advocate a system of decided ideals, of decided ends, that must be enforced, and this is Platonic progress, where the end has already been determined, and progress is towards a fixed end goal. Ironically, these most atheistic systems of anarchism and communism and their pseudo-supporters in the West, such as Breadtube, are, ideologically at their core, Platonic idealists.